The importance of organizational knowledge is emphasized by Nanaki and Techikuchi, the Japanese authors of The Knowledge Creating Company, when they argue that success depends on the capability of the company as a whole to create new knowledge, to disseminate it throughout the organization, and to embody it in products, services, and systems. This reinforces the view of Peter Senge in his classic study, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Science of the Learning Organization, that the organizations that will truly excel in the future will be the organizations that discover how to tap people's commitment and capacity to learn at all levels in an organization. The learning company goes beyond the idea of excellence to make learning the central process. Peters and Waterman, in their classic study In Search of Excellence, were, among others, very concerned with the adaptability, responsibility, and learning issues. The excellent companies are learning organizations, they argued. Experimenting and learning from mistakes are at the heart of their vision, although the more structured and formal approach to strategies of a learning organization were not articulated until a few years after their book had been published. If there is a responsibility and learning focus, then there is a natural sympathy for processes such as upward appraisal. In contrast, a power culture usually applies the traditional appraisal systems and many other techniques, such as TQM or empowerment, in a bureaucratic way, in the context of attempting to exert more control. And it should surprise no one that these programs frequently do not produce the results expected. The conclusions relating to the importance of a responsibility approach echo the earlier comments of Charles Handy, which challenges the view of Francis Bacon a few centuries ago when he argued knowledge itself is power. Somehow, the traditional knowledge is power culture has to be challenged. What is done with knowledge, whether it is kept or spread, can be a valuable indicator of whether the organization or individual is power or responsibility driven. Both new technology and more effective management approaches will require attitudes to power and responsibility to change radically in the future. This approach is reflected in the concluding paragraph of a recent book by Maschetti on the growth warriors, creating sustainable global advantage for America's technology industries, where he argued the ethical use of technology, coupled with responsible action on the part of industries and governments, can simultaneously raise both the quality of life and the quality of the environment throughout the world. If we can all learn to cooperate towards such a goal, the effects could be significant within our lifetime. To achieve this happy outcome, all that is needed is for each of us to accept our responsibilities as caretakers of the beautiful planet that abides us. A power-driven approach tends to be preoccupied with the short term, while a responsibility-driven approach is more concerned with long-term issues. As a result, a responsibility-driven approach is more likely to produce an effective balance of the respective interests of all the various stakeholders, so essential for the long-term success of any organization. This, in turn, helps to provide a climate where innovation is encouraged and where failure is an opportunity for learning rather than an excuse for punishment. In fact, responsibilities will only be rewarding and positive if they are supported by an overall learning approach to all aspects of life and work. Unfortunately, taking responsibility, being able to live with it, and then knowing how to use it and develop it in others is much rarer than ought to be the case. It is important to note that, in theory at least, there are grounds for perhaps expecting feminine characteristics to be more responsibility driven and hence more open to learning and more future-focused compared to their more traditionally power-driven male colleagues. However, further research is needed to establish whether or not this difference is significant. In addition, it will also be important to cross-check these factors against other possible cultural differences. The analysis here has argued that the center of the debate about leadership should be more about how and what we learn about responsibility rather than the traditional preoccupation with power. In order to make progress, we need to generate new alliances and improve the effectiveness of old ones, where learning for leadership helps to shift the historic approach, preoccupied with power, into a more positive direction, where the prime emphasis is on responsibility. Within this context, it is important to recognize that political correctness and attempts to overcome sexism and racism are essentially about the need to minimize, even try to eliminate, the abuse of power by encouraging a more responsibility-driven approach. Also, that the whole question of the role of ethics and ethical behavior by individuals needs to be firmly rooted in the issues raised here. In the end, the vital link between learning, leadership and responsibility needs to be much more widely recognized if we wish to be optimistic about the shape and nature of society in the decades ahead. But what do we do about this? At this stage, recognizing and emphasizing the importance of the link is a useful place to start, but it is only a beginning. As one authority, Bob Garrett, perceptively put it, the key facilitating role of directors is to create the climate in which learning is encouraged, rewarded, and allowed to flow freely around the organization. Again, at the other end of the spectrum, the importance of early learning cannot be overemphasized. Quoting Geraldine Bendel, "We have given children no framework within which to learn civic virtue and responsibility. We must devise better ways by which service to the community becomes part of everyday childhood experiences of the growth to adulthood. Morality is taught by being lived. It is learnt by doing." As we move further into what is now being called the knowledge society, with effective knowledge management as the critical success factor for organizations, it will be increasingly critical for organizations to focus on improving their ability to share knowledge, rather than indulge in the more traditional knowledge is power approach. This change of culture not only needs to start at the top, but it needs to be seen to be happening there too, if we are concerned with the long-term success of our organizations. One dimension that cannot be ignored in considering change in these areas is the role of language in changing culture and behavior. As Isaiah Berlin maintained, minds are formed by the character of language, not language by the minds of those who speak it. The dynamics of the language employees use to communicate with each other and with management is a key component in helping the company to decide what knowledge is legitimate and what is not, as the basis from which to see the future. The world both reflects the language we use and is changed by it. We are not talking here about the traditional view of political correctness, but nowhere are the issues of language more important and more apparent or more problematic than over the use of the words power and responsibility. Many people would argue, quite rightly in my view, that power and responsibility are invariably two sides of the same coin. Yet an extensive range of phrases incorporating the use of the word power appears to be in widespread use, such as power politics, power dressing, abuse of power, absolute power, power to the people, corridors of power, struggle for power, lust for power, balance of power, and so on. But would things start to be different, i.e., would the world become marginally a better place if we all just began to try to substitute the word responsibility wherever possible when the word power was mentioned? Perhaps it's up to us to start talking about the corridors of responsibility rather than the corridors of power. And when did we last hear of someone lusting after responsibility? Why not? Finally, if we want to improve both the effectiveness of our organizations and our quality of life in the 21st century, we have to start by improving the quality of our learning and continually emphasize its importance. How we learn, why we learn, what we learn, and then what do we do with that learning. Fortunately, the final point should not be too much of a problem if the first three are reasonably right. That should also be a particular focus for policy issues related to the learning development of the next generation. For change to be equated with progress, it is essential we move away from the traditional preoccupation with power towards an approach to decision-making and change that is much more responsibility-driven. Such changes will be of considerable benefit to our organizations in the long term, as well as being of considerable benefit to us, both as individuals and as members of society as a whole. Unless the relationship between power, responsibility, leadership and learning is both understood and effectively implemented in practice, it will be very difficult to be optimistic that we will be able to respond positively to the expected changes in the new millennium. On the other hand, if the relationship between these four critical words is well understood and effectively managed, then these challenges will be much more easily resolved, and our organizations are much more likely to be much more successful over the long term, which should be a benefit to us all. I believe the issues raised here are not only critically important for our future, but unfortunately, they rarely seem to get the attention they deserve. I hope this presentation goes a small way to help redress that balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Let us begin the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which now appear on your screen. We remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to avoid feedback. Our first question is from Colombia. It is from FENALCO, the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes en Medellín, Colombia. And the question is, how do we make our leaders more responsible? Dr. Lloyd, would you like to start?
Well, I think the first place to start is to try to make sure that we all understand what the issues are. And then when we have choices to make between who are the people who we consider to be our leaders, we take these issues about power and responsibility very seriously in making our own choices. And then hopefully we will end up by having leaders that are more responsibility-driven, more responsible for the broader interests of everybody that they are supposedly leading, rather than leaders where sometimes we find that their only concern is the pursuit of their own self-interest, which is, of course, in the end, extremely destructive both for them and for others who are involved.
Dr. Goldstein?
Well, I think there needs to be a place where people meet outside of the competitive interests of one group or another group, people in power, people not in power. I don't mean to use words. People in responsibility, people not in responsibility. I guess I would put the emphasis on the necessity to look to the trends that are shaping our future and to hope, I know I said at the beginning of our discussion, that people will be dragged into the future because they resist change. I would hope that it would be possible to identify, as I do during my presentation, those trends that are shaping the future and that are, in fact, unavoidable. And that by seeing where the world is going, people would naturally want to jump on the bandwagon. There is then a responsibility to carry out those activities, to take the kinds of initiatives that would lead us forward into a kind of a non-confrontational or non-oppositional future, that we might be able to meet someplace out there called where it's all going to happen.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mexico. It's from La Universidad La Salle in Mexico City in Mexico.
Good morning. The question is the following. Within a global context in which there are differences between rich and poor, and where therefore the rich countries are more powerful, how are they exercising their responsibilities on a global level?
Dr. Lloyd?
Well, there's a wide variety of ways in which they do this, and there are an awful lot more ways in which they could do it better. And the critical factor for those countries that do have power in the world today is to make sure that they exercise it responsibly in the interests of the global economy or the global world. Because if they don't, the consequences both for them and for everybody else are going to be extremely serious.
Thank you. Our next question is also from Mexico. It is from the Centro Universitario de Tijuana, from the Mexicali campus in Baja California.
Good morning. Most of the entrepreneurial business leaders and political leaders have a certain academic training that has taken place abroad, overseas. At least that's the case in Latin America. That makes them very difficult to apply what they learned in school into the businesses and companies in Latin America. And then that generates also a bad use and an irresponsible use of power. What do you recommend?
Dr. Lloyd, foreign education, what does it do to a leader that returns back to their native country? Is that education useful?
I think that there are lots of cases where it is useful, and there are lots of cases where there have been problems. If the education was very responsibility driven, it's much more likely, in my view, that those people who go back to their countries will be able to listen and learn from the local population to make sure that all the stakeholders in any decisions that they're involved with do get taken on board in their decision-making processes. What I hope doesn't happen is that people who come away from a particular country and get educated in another one end up by going back with a feeling of arrogance, that they know all the answers and that they try to impose these answers using what one might call a power culture, because that's the sort of thing that causes the problem.
Thank you. Our next question is from the Dominican Republic. It is from the Centro de Gestión e Investigación in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic.
Good morning. Once you have made the decision of being a responsible leader, what could the leader use, the decision maker, in order to prevent that power he has to contaminate his exercise and his duties? And how can he avoid being contaminated, consciously avoid it?
That's a very difficult question, because in many ways it depends upon the total education of the individual and the underlying values that they have that make them do what they're doing. And so sometimes it's very difficult to change these. But if they have this in the right package, and that package encourages them to listen and learn in the environment in which they operate, then they can take perhaps as their role models some of the remarkable leaders that we've had in the 20th century who have been very responsibility driven, and I'd name Gandhi and Nelson Mandela particularly as two individuals where this has been the case.
Bruce, I'd like to add to, there's a word we haven't used yet that I think is really at the core of a lot of things, and it has to do with the truth. And when you mentioned, for example, Gandhi, or you mentioned Nelson Mandela, there are certain people and there are certain circumstances that cry out for the truth being told and the truth being heard. And so I just want to inject that. I had said when we were earlier talking about how we make leaders more responsible, that we attempt to educate people to the trends, to the information, to the knowledge that is shaping our future. It seems to me that people who are in leadership positions, or people who want to affect people who are in leadership positions, need to articulate what is true for them. And the truth has a way somehow of being known. Everybody knows what the truth is. Even if they're not 100% sure, they sense that somebody is speaking truly. So I just want to inject that into this mix.
Thank you. Our next question is from Costa Rica. It is from the Centro Costarricense de Ciencia y Cultura in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Many leaders of the organizations have overcome different stages and arrived at this leadership position. And this would give the opportunity to young leaders to improve. That's our comment. That's what we have to say.
Dr. Lloyd, what can a young leader do to learn from the experience of an older leader?
Generally speaking, quite a lot. By learning and listening is a critical factor in the development of all leaders. And I'm a great believer, personally, that this difference between leadership and management is one that is more blurred than separated. Leadership issues operate at all levels of society, in all stages of organization. And the critical factor is for people to be genuinely concerned about the interests of the organization that they are in effect leading, or the group of people that they're leading, and not using that position to pursue primarily their own personal interests. If that happens, then that is invariably a recipe for disaster.
Our next question is from Mexico. It is from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la Facultad de Estudios Superiores in Cuautitlán, the city of Cuautitlán in the state of Mexico.
Morning. Buenos días. We would like you to please comment on the change, the culture of change, or the culture of risk in this, at this time of changes in all of Latin American societies.
Well, that's certainly a big question. And I think that there's been a whole spectrum of leaders in Latin America, and you're probably in a better position than I am to judge those leaders who you would consider to be power-driven leaders, as opposed to those leaders who you consider are driven by a deep sense of responsibility for their country or for their area or for their company. And I would hope and expect that the evidence that you would come to after evaluating that would be that the responsibility-driven leaders have produced better results for everybody over the longer term. But of course, the challenges are still with us today and will be with us for decades, if not centuries ahead, to make sure that those people who have positions of power do exercise it as responsibly as possible in the broad interests of everybody involved.
Our next question is from Panama, from la Universidad Tecnológica de Panamá, Centro Regional Chiriquí in Panama.
Muy buenos días. The question is the following. From the four major components for success, which one do you think is the most relevant or the key one in order for a university as an organization? And also, we would like to know, if you omit or skip one of these elements, is it still possible to attain success?
It is possible, but the probability of attaining success is very much increased if you can get that package right, get the balance right between power, leadership, power, responsibility, leadership, and learning. Of course, sometimes you can be successful in the short term, or can appear to be successful, by having one of those factors and leaving the others out. But if you want to be successful over the long term, it's very important to make sure that the balance between all those factors is achieved as far as possible.
Thank you. Our next question is from Bolivia. It is from la Universidad Privada Boliviana in Cochabamba, Bolivia.
Good morning, Dr. Lloyd. Amongst other elements, you have just highlighted the importance of learning in the organization. Don't you think that this is a dilemma for leadership, perhaps? In other words, for example, if you learn more productivity, higher salaries, and so how do you think we should approach this dilemma?
The historical problem has been that autocratic organizations have tended to believe that the people at the top have the answers to everything. That is increasingly not the case. So it is absolutely critical for those at the top of an organization who have responsible leadership positions that they are open to new learning and open to managing the change that comes from that learning in the broader interests of everybody in the organization. Now, there are some very important issues around salaries that can arise over in some organizations, and I think the salary question needs to be seen within the context of whether or not the individual is operating a power-driven or a self-interested approach, or a broader, more responsibility-driven approach, in which case the salary policies are likely to be significantly different.
Thank you for your questions. Let us begin now with Module 2, in which Dr. Goldstein will present his ideas on the trends shaping the 21st century.
How would you really behave if you knew what the future was going to look like? How would you use that information? How would you run your organization or act professionally? How would you conduct your personal life? If you could really see into the future, how would you vote on political matters? And how would you want to see public policy shaped? Well, if you think that you don't have to answer those questions because no one knows the future, think again. I would go so far as to suggest that far more than just the broad outlines of the next 2 or 3 decades are predictable. In fact, the 21st century is staring us in the face. I would also insist that once we know what the future is going to look like, we have to have the courage to meet it head on. We need to be able to minimize the negatives and to maximize the positives so that we can capitalize on true opportunity in the 21st century. In other words, Having real knowledge, knowing something as empowering as seeing the future, becomes a mandate, a call to action. It is less a matter of power than of responsibility.